So after I recorded this whole thing, I realized I should probably do an introduction. So, hi, I'm Veronica Fortune. I am the producer, writer, editor, and voice of Past, the podcast about those who would never rule. And this is my YouTube channel. I hope you'll enjoy it. I'll get better at this, guys. So, which king or queen had the worst in-laws? Yeah, it's totally a clickbait title. Let's just go with it. First off, no, I will not be discussing any modern royal in-laws. In my opinion, most of the modern royal in-laws are either kind or inconsequential. Their scandals are nothing when compared to the past, though not to be overlooked in general. And at the end of the day, most of the royals that impact my viewers have so little say on our lives, they might as well not be royal. No. I'll be looking at historical rulers instead. I'll try to do one of these for random countries going forward, and this will be an ongoing series. Let me know if there's anyone you think should be on this list. Seriously, write it in the comments for me, it really helps. The first king is Henry III of England, whom you might have never heard of. Those who have, though, he's a bold choice. I'm being slightly expansive in my definition of in-laws, but just go with me. I'm sure a few of you who are in the know were hoping for Edward II, but I think his half-brothers and cousins hurt him just as much as his in-laws. Henry III, though, well, it's painful, and you may not have heard of most of this before. As a monarch, I think Henry III is often overlooked. Despite his long rule, 56 years, the fourth longest of an English reign, and the fifth for any monarch of the United Kingdom. Don't worry, I'm not forgetting about you, Scotland. He is often ignored when discussing baronial uprisings, with most looking to his father, King John, he of Robin Hood fame. He is also eclipsed by his son, Edward I, Longshanks, when it comes to kingly power. You may have heard of him if you've watched Braveheart. Poor Henry also had to deal with not one in-law group being problematic, not two, but three separate in-law groups. Who were these people, you're asking at this point? Well, Henry III was the King of England from October 1216 until November 1272. He was the oldest son of King John and John's second wife, Isabella of Angoulême. He became king at the age of 9 after his father died from too many peaches and dysentery. Good old dysentery. King John had been in the middle of a war of sorts before his death, and for a moment it looked like England would become a French holding. But let's not worry too much about that today. Isabella of Angoulême was not invited to be her son's regent. Instead, William the Marshal, whom you might remember from the Empress Matilda's podcast episodes. William was and is considered one of the greatest knights of his age. At least, that's what the poem he commissioned says. But really, William was a great statesman of England and went out of his way to protect young Henry. He'll be getting his own special episode on Past for patrons later this year when I cover what happened with Henry II's great plans. While Henry III's mother wasn't deeply involved in his government, she is the entry point of his first set of in-laws to cause him problems. Isabella had been very young when she married King John. She was at the oldest 14 and possibly 12. John was 33. Oh, and she was his second wife. What's even worse is that prior to their marriage, she had been betrothed to a man named Hugh IX, Count of La Marche, Seigneur of Lusignan. Hugh IX, who was at least 15 years older than Isabella, had been married previously and had a son from that first union, Hugh X Lusignan, whom I'll just call Hugh de Lusignan, was about the same age as Isabella. Prior to King John's death in 1216, his and Isabella's oldest daughter, Joan of England, who was 6 at this point, had been betrothed to Hugh de Lusignan. Joan had been sent to Hugh's county of La Marche at the time of her betrothal. Don't worry, there was nothing untoward about this. She would likely be looked after by his stepmother or sister. She would learn the culture of that court, what was expected of her. Yes, it's shocking to us to separate a young child from their parents, and it might have upset little Joan, but it wasn't malicious. The elder Hugh died in 1219, and the younger Hugh became the Count of La Marche. Joan was still young to marry. She had to be the canonical age of 12 for girls. Before Joan could be married, Isabella swooped in and stole her husband. Yes, this is where the first in-law problems come from. Isabella, who was either 32 or 34 in 1220, married the son of her previously betrothed and the betrothed of her daughter. I do wonder if she waited until the elder Hugh died so as not to hurt his feelings. Isabella had given birth to her first child, Henry III, in 1207 when she was 19 or 21, and she and King John had a total of 5 children, all whom survived to adulthood. Hugh de Lusignan said, "Hold my beer." With him, Isabella had 9 children, all whom survived to adulthood. That's 14 children. For her, she was 41 or 43 when she had her youngest. Oh, and none of these children were twins, though she may have had 2 in the same year. This means the rather young King of England, only 13 at this point, had a powerful and, as we'll see soon, grasping stepfather. And he would soon have 5 half-brothers who were ambitious and 4 half-sisters who needed husbands. This isn't even taking into account his 3 full sisters who needed husbands, including the one who had just been jilted, and 1 full brother who needed something to do because you can't have these rich nobles just sitting around with nothing to do. Oh, and Isabella and Hugh held on to young Joan initially until the Pope intervened. She would eventually marry the King of Scotland, Alexander II, the year after her mother married her fiancé. I will come back to Henry III's stepfather and half-siblings, who I'm lumping in the in-law category. They all need to grow up and start making some bad decisions first. Now I'll get to the traditional in-laws, Henry III's wife and her family. Henry took a little longer than most kings to get married, despite trying. His initial matches included Margaret of Scotland, who was the daughter of the Scottish king, Alexander II. Henry was also interested in Yolande, the daughter of the Duke of Brittany. And finally, he was close enough to marrying Joan of Ponthieu to be looking at papal consent when he was stymied by his cousin Blanche of Castile, the Dowager Queen of France. By the time he finally found a wife, he was 29. Remember, he had ruled a kingdom for 20 years at this point, and this was a time that men could be married as young as 14. Guys, don't get married at 14. He finally found a bride in 1236 when he wed Eleanor of Provence, who was 12 or 13. Yes, if you listen to the podcast or follow me on here, you'll hear about plenty more marriages between very young women and much older men. I'm sorry. Before anyone gets upset, Eleanor herself appears to be a good bride for Henry, at least in Henry's eyes. To the people of London, she and her family were seen as a bit of a problem. She, being a rather young woman, needed some members of her family to join her, so her maternal uncles and cousins followed her over to England, and they were known as the Savoyards. Along with them, about 150 other Savoyards came. Eleanor's mother had 9 brothers. Of these, William, Peter, and Boniface lived in England for a time and were influential to the family. Philip wouldn't spend much time in England, but was able to gain ecclesiastical offices in England and was active in Henry III's continental concerns. Yes, apparently one could hold offices in England and not live there most of the time. It's like newspaper owners today. London had never liked foreigners. It was often a bit xenophobic throughout this entire period of history. It really didn't like foreigners receiving state funding, especially those that were just trying to get rich off their niece's lucky marriage. To make things even worse, Henry and Eleanor didn't have children right away. As I mentioned, she was only 12 or 13, so I'm okay with that. But Londoners were not. Despite this, the couple did go on to have 5 children. The oldest, Edward, the future Edward I, was born in 1239. so when Eleanor was only 15 or 16. Of note, Eleanor's brother William died that same year, but she had plenty of other brothers left to upset the Londoners. Eleanor and her family's problems with the people of London would lead to long-term issues for Henry III. Oh, and there's one more thing I should mention about Henry III's wife. Her brother-in-law was the King of France, Louis IX. Her sister Margaret married Louis in 1234. For those who don't listen to the podcast, Louis IX is better known to history as Saint Louis, and he is often considered one of the great kings of France. This relationship will be the in-law relationship that helps Henry III the most, though it's not always easy for him. And now I introduce the last in-law group for Henry III, his brother-in-law. Remember how I said Henry had 3 full sisters who would need husbands? So, which brother-in-law was the issue? Well, let's see who each married. Joan, as I mentioned, married Alexander II of Scotland in 1221 at the age of 11. So 1 down. Next was Isabella. She married the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II in 1235, making her a rather old bride for the time at 21. And this left Eleanor. She had originally been married to William Marshal, not Henry III's regent, his son of the same name. This wedding happened in 1224, when she was 9 and he was 34. He died in 1231 when Eleanor was 16. She decided to make her brother's life easy after this and swore a religious vow of chastity. So that solved all of that, right? No. She did really swear the oath of chastity, but she failed. I know, complete scandal. A medieval princess having a love affair. Someone tell the church. Oh, they did, and the church wasn't pleased. Who was this love affair with? None other than Simon de Montfort, the 6th Earl of Leicester. Wait, who is that? Well, you should know, but it's okay if you don't. The English crown wasn't a big fan of his in the long run, and I bet even the modern royals don't want to talk about him. Before I scandalize Eleanor more than needed, we don't know if Simon seduced her prior to their marriage. But we do know that Henry III accused him of doing so, and that the couple's marriage occurred in secret in January 1238. Their first child, Henry, was born around 11 months after their wedding, so no smoking gun there. As you've probably guessed, Simon is the problem in-law, and as you might have also guessed, I'm a bit of a fan of Simon. Other than his anti-Semitism and crusading. Yeah. Just sharing my biases. In fairness, Alexander II of Scotland did cause a few problems for Henry III, but nothing compared to Simon. Simon will, in all fairness, be the biggest thorn in Henry's side. So who is this Simon de Montfort? Well, he's a Frenchman who is also a little English and Henry III's brother-in-law. Okay, you want more. Okay. Simon's father, also Simon de Montfort, had been the oldest son of another Simon de Montfort, an Amice, the Suja Countess of Leicester. It's through Amice that our Simon will claim Leicester. Now, at the start of his life, it looked like England and Leicester wouldn't make any impact on Simon's life. He was born and raised in France. His father claimed the title Earl of Leicester, but it was held in fact by their cousin, Ranulph, the Earl of Chester. He had a few earldoms. The elder Simon's French holdings and influence were vast, and England really didn't need to play a part in either of their lives. The younger Simon was the second son, and his father might have been planning to expand the family holdings to prepare some inheritance for him. Sadly for Henry III, this never happened. The elder Simon was killed by a projectile while besieging Toulouse on the 25th of June, 1218, as part of the Albigensian Crusade. This was the French Crusade that eventually destroyed the Catholic Christian minority of France. The younger Simon was only about 10 at the time. His older brother, Amaury, was 26 and succeeded to their father's French holdings and titles. But the brothers agreed that Simon should try to regain their family's English holdings. So, once Simon came of age in 1229, he went to the English court and asked Henry III for his family's titles back. He was lucky. Henry was charmed by the young man, but couldn't just take the holdings from Ranulph. He was a very powerful man. But Henry allowed Simon to approach the elder man. At this point, Ranulph was near 60, which was not young back in the 13th century. And Simon got lucky again. Ranulph was equally charmed by him, and Ranulph had never had any children. He had sisters and nephews, who he would grant his primary holdings to, but he decided to turn over Leicester to Simon. It was a long process, but by 1239, Simon held the title and some land. While he was waiting to be formally ennobled, he seduced the king's sister, as I mentioned earlier. So now we have the three main in-law factions outlined. But how did they hurt Henry III's kingship? Well, the Savoyards are simple. Their presence and control undermined any popularity the common people had for Henry. In addition, he alienated his native nobility by marrying his wife's family into members of these noble families. Marriage has always been an important way to cement alliances, and some of the nobility didn't like foreigners suddenly having control of local lands, possibly lands that they themselves were trying to marry into. Yes, it is completely xenophobic, but it's not unexpected. So I've got my first wobbly wheel. Second comes Henry's stepfather and half-siblings. Henry wanted to reconquer his family's continental holdings. His grandparents, Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, had controlled all of England, parts of Ireland, and most of the left of France. And Phil might have a map for this, so thank you, Phil, for that. But Henry's father, King John, had lost almost all their French territorial possessions in 1214 at the Battle of Bouvines against Philip II of France. England only held a small part of southwest France. Again, thank you for that map, Philip. Henry's stepfather, Hugh de Lusignan, didn't like that Louis IX, the current French king, had appointed his brother Alphonse, Count of Poitou, a title that meant that Hugh would need to swear fealty to Alphonse. He was also worried that Alphonse would stifle his traditional freedoms. The nobility of Poitou, the Poitevins, didn't like this change in leadership either. These two, along with the Count of Toulouse, formed a secret alliance against Louis IX and his family. Hugh promised his stepson that he would militarily support him if Henry would come help. Henry thought that he could win back his grandfather's great empire. In the end, the English lost horribly. Henry's Lusignan family helped him make some bad tactical decisions. Podcast listeners will know I don't do battles, so you will not get a summary here, sorry. And Henry's brother-in-law, Simon, yelled at him and compared him to Charles the Simple, a French king from the 9th century who was deposed by his nobility. Foreshadowing Simon? Louis IX and Henry III eventually made up, and Henry even paid homage. But the damage to Henry's standing in England had been done. That's a second wobbly wheel. Henry did try to distract his brother-in-law. He sent Simon to Gascony, the remaining English continental holding, to govern. Simon was a bit high-handed there and upset a few members of the nobility. They appealed to Henry, who set up a formal audit. Simon was found to have not done anything wrong, but was personally sick of Henry at this point. He resigned his post and retired to France. His wife and children were with him. They were an incredibly close family. King Louis was away on the 7th Crusade, his first of two, and had left his powerful mother, Blanche of Castile, as his regent. I should note that I think Blanche is amazing, and I should probably talk about her more in the future. She's stellar. Blanche died in November of 1252 at the age of 64, while Louis was away. The nobility of France needed a new regent, and they looked to Simon. Yes, an English earl who had previously fought against their own king. Simon kindly turned them down. He had reached the point where he wanted to return to England and make up with his brother-in-law. Now, this next bit deserves its own episode, and I do plan on giving Simon de Montfort his own special episode on the podcast, so it is coming. Until then, though, let's see if I can sum up things in a paragraph or two. In 1254, as a member of Parliament, Simon stood up against Henry III's wishes for a temporary increase in taxation. Simon had been listening to the grumblings of the nobility and the common people. He knew Henry wasn't popular, mainly due to those other two wobbly wheels. So he took a chance. The following year, he tried to push through reform legislation that would limit the king's power. At this time, the king was an almost absolute power. Over the next 7 years, these attempts to gain some power from the king ended up failing because Henry was able to gain some baronial support. But let's call this the third wobbly wheel. Simon wasn't done, though. I mean, he was for the moment. He left for France again in 1261 and didn't return until 1263. And that return is where the wheels come off. The other barons had turned hostile towards Henry. All he had failed at, his support of his in-laws over their English rights, his allowing his stepfamily to walk all over him, his general poor control of the country. They invited Simon to return. At first, Simon got along with Henry, mainly because Henry let him attack Jewish groups in England, and they shared the spoils of these horribly anti-Semitic raids. I did mention this anti-Semitism earlier. It was gross, and in general happens to be a huge stain on the legacy of many leading people throughout history. Simon became even wealthier through these asset seizures and more powerful. He was allowed by Henry to take control of council. Henry III's son, Edward, was not a fan of this. Edward had actually been close to his uncle in the 1250s, but had since come to support his father. He began building his own power base using bribes, but was able to secure support against his uncle and convinced Henry to appeal to Louis IX to adjudicate his and Simon's disagreement. Louis already had a saintly reputation at this point and was thought to be a fair man. He, though, was worried about the precedent that overruling a fellow monarch would have and sided with Henry. And this led directly to civil war in England, with Henry III, his brother, Richard of Cornwall, and his son Edward on one side, and Simon, his 5 sons, and his various retainers on the other. On the 14th of May, 1264, Simon and his forces won. Henry, Richard, and Edward were all captured, along with 2 men whose family names should be recognized by podcast listeners, Roger Mortimer and Humphrey de Bohun. For those who haven't listened to the podcast yet, the former is the grandfather of the Roger Mortimer, who will come into play in the time of Edwards II and III as the purported lover of Isabella of France, the wife of Edward II and the mother of Edward III. And the latter is the 5 times maternal great-grandfather to Henry V. Oh, and Mortimer will come up one more time in today's episode. I wasn't joking when I said the wheels came off. The king, his brother, and his heir are now under the control of Simon and his faction. Things looked really bad for Henry. I wasn't joking when I said he had the worst in-laws. His wife Eleanor did avoid capture and made plans to help him. But she was stymied by the fact that her son was in captivity. While Henry might have had the worst in-laws, he and Eleanor had built a rather impressive nuclear family. They were very close to their children, who were mostly raised within their own household. I will also say that while Henry was a prisoner, he wasn't treated poorly. He just had no power. Edward was about 25 at the time he was captured and had already shown great military prowess. Because he was a prince, he wasn't kept in poor conditions. He was even allowed to ride daily for exercise. 1 year and 2 weeks after his initial capture, he escaped his guard. He apparently spent the morning trying out all the horses in the stable. And then he got to the last one and he rode off. No one could catch him because they had tired horses. This story may be apocryphal, but I had to share it. Just imagine being that guard, watching your charge just ride off, realizing your horse could never catch him. Edward was able to link up with a defector from Simon's side, as well as other royal supporters. On the 4th of August, 1264, Henry III's biggest in-law problem was solved for him. Prince Edward and his forces met Simon and his forces at the Battle of Evesham, and Henry was actually a prisoner at the battle. Edward's forces won, resoundingly. Simon was basically hunted down by an assassination squad. His actual death was caused by Roger Mortimer. Simon's son Henry, named for the king, also died at the battle. His surviving sons, Guy, Simon, and Amory, fled to France with their mother. His daughter, Eleanor, had been married not long before the battle to Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, the Prince of Wales, and she died in childbirth in 1282. As for Henry, he reigned another 7 years after regaining his freedom. He wasn't kind to those who rebelled against him and survived the battle, but no one should expect a king in this time to be kind to rebels. Lands were forfeit, and the royal treasury was enhanced in the process. At this point, Prince Edward took an active role in government. Things were so secure that the prince was able to go on crusade in 1270. It was what all the cool kids did then. When Henry died on the 16th of November, 1272, Edward was on his return journey from the Middle East. He wouldn't make it back to England until 1274. So, how do you think Henry III's in-laws compared to other royal in-laws? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you want more of me talking, but in podcast form, please check out the podcast with the links in the description. And thank you as always. I have another fun video planned, and do remember to check out my Patreon for early videos and early podcast episodes, plus special episodes of the podcast. Thank you as always. Bye.